Welcome back. The panel is with us from their remote locations. NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Andrea Mitchell, pulmonologist Dr. Vin Gupta of the University of Washington, and NBC News Senior Business Correspondent Stephanie Ruhle. And as you can see here, guys, I wanted to just basically hit three big things here on the government's response, on the economics, on health, and on politics. As of this morning, more than 53,000 Americans have died. Less than 2% of the population has been tested. And even the trillions Congress has approved isn't nearly enough and often isn't getting to the people who need it. Andrea Mitchell, I want to start with the political response collectively. There's the president and then there's everyone else. And I don't know how much of it you believe the president is sort of coloring the atmosphere, which is why it looks like Congress is slow off the mark here, or we're just got to be prepared for a polarized Congress going forward?
Well, I think the president is going his own way with misinformation, with those daily briefings, which we now are told he is suspending. He's finally backing off. I'll believe it when I see it after this weekend as to whether he resumes, because he so needs to fill his own demand, his need for self-congratulation, really, and for to show what he believes is leadership, that we've seen dangerous, toxic advice coming from the White House. And unfortunately, I think that the credibility of the scientists really now is on the line, that they have to decide whether to stay inside and be valuable or whether or not they have to see another alternative like Jim Mattis and quit. Because when Dr. Birx said to you today that sunlight does kill the virus, she is perpetuating an unscientific, untested, single study presented by a non-scientist from the Department of Homeland Security, which led to the president, as she put it, not fully digesting the data. She needed to be very clear on disavowing it. And to this point, she still has not been, even this morning.
Dr. Gupta, are you worried that Dr. Birx is letting her credibility get sort of sucked into the Trump vortex?
I really admire Dr. Birx, and yeah, I have to say that whether it was not pushing back strongly enough on Georgia's willingness to liberalize social distancing, and especially when it came to tattoo parlors, I can understand if we want to liberalize the notion of how we think about what is essential and non-essential, to what's safe and not safe. But to not push back on tattoo parlors and that policy by the Georgia governor, to me, was the start of a pattern. And so I do think, as somebody that admires her and her history in public health and our armed forces, it does appear that there's some degree of filter on what she says, and she is minding her words, instead of, as Andrea says, coming out and saying the truth and just being direct about it.
I want to stay with you here a second, Dr. Gupta, and ask you about the testing comments that she made. That really struck me as one of the headlines out of the interview, when she basically acknowledged maybe the wrong word, because there may be disputes about this, but essentially saying the current situation, we're not going to be able to ramp up testing under the current situation. Do you concur with her on that? Or do you think that's just sort of, they're just trying to come up with an explanation to follow the policy the president wants?
I think she's right, actually. We need outside-the-box thinking, and so she's spot on. Under the current situation, Dr. Ulcerholm beautifully laid it out, that right now, every new technology that the FDA is putting out there largely is constrained by the same supply chain bottlenecks that, Chuck, you and I have talked endlessly about. Swabs, reagents. Right. He just said it. He just laid it out. That's why we need more of a focus on interesting, new, creative, outside-the-box thinking, innovations like the Rutgers scientists on saliva. By definition, circumnavigating these supply chain bottlenecks. You spit in a tube, potentially you can mail it to a lab if you do it at home. Yeah. That's not that far off. So right now, under the way we're thinking about it, the inside-the-box constrained thinking, yes, I think she's correct.
Stephanie Ruhle, I want to move to the economy here. And we saw the sort of what some said, was an additional amount of money. And look, $500 billion is not chump change. But considering where we are, do you think it's sustainable for Congress to look at this sector by sector when they come up with bailouts? Or this idea that a few members of Congress have of covering all payrolls for a while, is that going to end up being the path we have to go down?
We're getting closer and closer to that idea, Chuck, because if this is a natural disaster, an act of God, and Congress wants to say, let's put a bear hug around the economy because we've asked the country to basically shut down, then they're going to have to find a different mechanism to support all businesses. Because right now, as you mentioned it, yes, the CARES Act is adding an additional over $500 billion. But you know it's not reaching every business. The head of the Small Business Association says every hour another small business is closing. And even though there may be pent-up demand and everybody wants to get back out there and get to work, it's not going to work that way. We're a consumer-based economy. People aren't rushing back to the store.
And Stephanie, the issue of sector by sector, I've been thinking about the politics of bailing out oil companies or the politics of bailing out casinos or the politics of those things, of bailing out athletics, for instance. And it can look bad politically, but there's a whole bunch of jobs that are connected to that. How do you avoid that sort of political winners and losers unless you go this cover everybody's payroll the same way?
Unfortunately, you don't. And those who are the have-nots are going to be the ones who are furious that they're left out. We know from Bill Gates and a number of others, this is disproportionately hurting the poorest or those who don't have big lobbying efforts. So yes, you can see big oil demanding, saying, we need to call this an act of God. You need to protect us, or the cruise industry. But I promise you, small restaurants and barbershops don't have that. So even if we're saying, well, the small business effort is to help those small businesses, there are 30 million small businesses in this country. And the first round of small business help only got 1.7 million loans out there. It certainly didn't reach everyone.
You know, Andrea, it is pretty clear that the campaign is going to turn into who do you trust to handle the pandemic recovery here. But we may not be through the health crisis at the same time. It's really going to complicate our politics.
Absolutely. And it is already who do you trust? We see it in the polling that most people in our poll and other polls don't want to reopen as rapidly as the president and some supporters, what could be a new emerging Tea Party movement, are pressing. But I think that the American people are going to be very afraid. This economy, according to Kevin Hassett, who's come back into the administration as a top economist, people are going to see that it's not going to flip back on. It is going to be slow and in phases. And I'm very concerned also that the president, what he did with West Point, for instance, showing that he needs to go to West Point, blindsiding West Point just because he saw Mike Pence going to the Air Force Academy. West Point isn't prepared to announce that they're bringing all those cadets back. That's the kind of thing we have to be really worried about.
Yeah, where the president's worried about the president first, anyway. Thank you, all three of you. When we come back, we're going to take a close look at how some counties that may determine the 2020 presidential election are faring during the pandemic. Hello from Washington, I'm Chuck Todd, and thanks for checking out the Meet the Press channel on YouTube. Click on the button down here to subscribe and click over here to watch the latest interviews, highlights, and other digital exclusives.